Well, it's a huge privilege to be here with you. I was going to say, looking out at you, it's a great, but I can't see most of you because of the lights, but I'll assume you're actually there. And it's been great, actually, to come to the forum over many years and just to learn from so many of you, so talented, and I know some people here for the first time, just remarkable people. We're going to be looking at the life of David, so turn in your Bibles, please, to 1 Samuel, or 1 Samuel if you prefer, and we're going to be looking at the life of David, which is a remarkable life. I was trying to work out just how much of the Bible is occupied with David, either written by David or about things related to David. Maybe it's about a seventh of the Bible. It's a remarkable thing. He is the most named human in the Bible. Even more than Jesus, the name David occurs. Very big. And if we're going to think as leaders, there's a huge amount worked out about the narrative of his life. So we have a lot to learn just by studying the life of David and thinking about it. And today we're going to go to that famous passage in 1 Samuel chapter 17 about David and Goliath. Now, it is not like the film Titanic. The film Titanic, you know what's going to happen to the Titanic. And in the David and Goliath, it's probably no secret to any Christian leader that David actually wins. That takes one verse. So how on earth do we have 58 verses in this chapter? Well, we're going to read them. All of them. Yes. 1 Samuel chapter 17. Now the Philistines, and for some of you that's Philistines, but I'm going to say Philistines, the Philistines gathered their armies for battle, and they gathered at Socoh, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Socoh and Azekah in Ephes Dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered and encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in line of battle against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And there came out from the camp of the Philistines a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits, that's 4 arm length, and a span. So somewhere short of 3 meters, just over 9 feet tall. And there came out of the camp of the Philistines of Goliath of Gath, done that, and he had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze, which will work out something like 55 kilograms or 120 pounds. Do we have anyone weighing 55 kilograms or 120 pounds prepared to admit out there? There might be some people. No? No one? Shy. Okay, fine. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. And the shaft of his spear was like a weaver's beam. And his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron, or 7 kilograms, 15 pounds. And his shield bearer went before him. And he stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." And the Philistine said, "I defy the ranks of Israel today. Give me a man that we may fight together." When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to the battle, and the names of the 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab the firstborn, next him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 eldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. For 40 days the Philistine came forward and took his stand morning and evening. And Jesse said to David his son, "Take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See if your brothers are well, and bring some token from them." Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah, fighting the Philistines, And David rose early in the morning and left the sheep with a keeper, and took the provisions and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in the charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. And David heard them. All the men of Israel, when they saw him, fled from him and were very much afraid. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who's come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. And David said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way. So shall it be done for the man who kills him. Now Eliab, the eldest brother, when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you've come down to see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned away toward another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent for him. And David said to Saul, no man's heart failed because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you're not able to go and fight this Philistine, to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of its mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. Then Saul clothed David with his armor, and put a helmet of bronze on his head, and clothed him with a coat of mail. And David strapped his sword over his armor, and he tried in vain to go, for he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. So David put them off. Then he took his staff in his hand and chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand as he approached the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. And the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran and stood over the Philistine and took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. And the men of Israel and Judah rose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Sha'araim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their camp. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. As soon as Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of his army, "Abner, whose son is this youth?" And Abner said, "As your soul lives, O king, I do not know." And the king said, "Inquire whose son the boy is." And as soon as David returned from striking down the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered, "I am the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite." Well, it's an amazing story, and it's not just a story. This has lots of evidence for its historical truth. But the danger is when we have a story like this, and we seem very familiar with it, is we often stop reading, and we miss out the details, the really important details, like the cheese. Did you notice the cheese? So what we're going to do is we're going to go through the story, and then we're going to look at how it applies to us. The context is that the people of Israel have recently asked for a king, and they got Saul, who was tall. And at this time, there was a significant threat from the Philistines, and the Philistines gather their armies to a place called Soko, which belongs to Judah, which was the tribe from which David came. And the Philistines have a very impressive soldier called Goliath, although most of the time he doesn't get named Goliath, he just gets called the Philistine because, after all, he's not a very important figure. But they think he's important because he's very tall, and not only is he extremely tall and therefore scary, he also has 3 sorts of defensive armor. He's got his helmet, he has his leg armor called greaves, and he has his body armor, which is of a special flexible kind. As well as his 3 sorts of body armor, he has 3 weapons. He has his sword, he has a spare weapon on his back, and he has this spear, which is described as like a weaver's beam or weaver's pole. What does that mean? Well, it means that it's got a cord or rope round it, like you would sometimes see on a Greek vase, or for some of you, Greek vase, which means that someone can hold it and throw it at a greater distance. You use that cord also to retrieve it. So let's not think that this is a baton between someone who is slow and cannot throw at distance and someone who can throw at distance. That's not the case. What's more, this spear has a 7-kilogram iron head, the harder metal, that can go through any armor. It will knock you down. He can get you at a distance. And it's not only that he has his 3 defensive pieces of armor and his 3 weapons, he also has a shield bearer. Now notice this is a shield bearer, not an armor bearer. What's the difference? Well, he just carries the shield, obviously, and the key thing is, it's not that he says, "Oh, armor bearer, please throw me my hammer, please throw me my mattock," or anything like that. The shield bearer carries the shield, and there are 2 Hebrew words for shield. And when we look at the way they are used and the different weights that they have, we know that this is the big shield. And the shield bearer, it says, on 2 occasions in this passage, goes in front of him. So they know about distance warfare, they know about arrows, okay? So the shield bearer is going with a big shield in front of him precisely so that you cannot get him at a distance. So when you look at this man, you see someone with huge military experience, great armor, great weapons. He can get you, he seems unbeatable. And he challenges Israel to single combat. Whoever wins the combat, well, the other lot are going to be servants. And what he does is he is so confident in this challenge that he makes that he defies Israel. What's the response of Saul, who was tall, and the rest of Israel? Well, they're filled with great fear. Then we have a change of scene. We go to that scene where we're reminded of David. We heard about him in the previous chapter. He's the youngest son of old Jesse. And here he is, and we'd learned in the previous chapter that he had been anointed by the prophet Samuel. He'd been told that he was going to be the king of Israel. And by sheer coincidence, no, it wasn't coincidence, but it seemed by sheer coincidence, straight after being anointed, he got a part-time job as a musician in the palace. And what we learn is that he's going back and forth from the palace to looking after the flock. And just at the moment, he's not needed at the palace. After all, Saul is at war. And so what we see is there he is looking after the sheep while the, how many? 3 oldest brothers are with Saul. So we see lots of 3s in this story, which is historically true, but also told so that you can remember it rather better. Now, at this point, Jesse decides to send his son. Why does he decide to send David rather than anyone else? Well, he had other sons. And we also know there's a keeper of the sheep. So there are other people he could have sent. But he decides, by sheer coincidence, but actually by God's providence, to send David. And he sends him with 3 foods. Parched, roasted grain. Oh, that's so delicious. Are you looking forward to some parched, roasted grain for lunch? How many of you in your local foods, in your countries, have parched grain to eat? Not very nice, but I suppose it lasts. That's for the brothers. And then we have the bread. That's for the brothers. And then 10 cheeses. Not for the brothers. No, that's for the commander of the 1,000. You see, one of the things you need to know in life is if you want to get on, you need to give the best stuff to the most important people, okay? So Jesse has got this idea that, imagine if 1,000 sets of parents are giving that sort of stuff to the leader of the 1,000. Well, he'd be doing rather well. But that often happens when people are in leadership. We'll think about that in a while. So anyway, he comes along with these 3 foods, and we learn in verse 19 about how these 2 armies are facing each other. They seem to be doing some sort of fighting, but there's also this space in between them. And David arrives, by sheer coincidence, just at the time when Goliath is starting his morning sermon. And as Goliath is delivering his rant, we see that the 2 armies seem to be gearing up for battle, and yet when they hear Goliath, the Israelites are all afraid. And the people say to David, "Have you seen this man?" There's a great reward if anyone can beat him. You know the reward? Loads of money. Oh, and also freedom from taxes. I mean, loads of money plus freedom from taxes. That's quite a combination, isn't it? And you know the third bit? Royal wedding. That you get to marry the king's daughter. Amazing. This is the 3 parts of the reward. And the others are saying, "Have you seen this man?" What's David's response? "Who is this uncircumcised Philistine? This guy's dirty. He's unclean. Who does he think he is?" Other people are wowed. They think this is amazing. This guy's so scary. And David is not at all impressed. Who does he think he is? There is a living God. And in comparison with him, Goliath is just a speck. He's insignificant. He's unclean. Well, David's oldest brother gets to hear about this, Eliab. He hears that David is asking about the reward, and he is annoyed. Now, he's got a difficult job because he's got a younger brother who's been anointed to be king, and yet he's the oldest brother, and he wants to put down his brother. And so he says, "With whom did you leave those sheep?" So he's trying to say you're being irresponsible. But at the same time, he wants to say, you've not got a very significant job. So he has to say, "With whom did you leave those few sheep?" There's only a few of them. So he's trying to belittle his brother. It's a very difficult line for Eliab to tread, really, where he's trying to belittle his brother. Well, the answer is he left them with a keeper. We know that from verse 20. Now, Eliab knew that his brother had been anointed. It says in chapter 16 that David was anointed in the midst of his brothers. He knew that. But clearly he despised that. We saw in the previous chapter how Samuel had been sent to anoint one of Jesse's sons, and he didn't know who it was to be. And when he saw Eliab, he thought, wow, he's got a great outward appearance. He looks like he's going to be a great leader of God's people. And God said, don't look at him. Don't look at his height. For God doesn't look as man looks. Man looks on the outward appearance, and God looks on the heart. And he said, I've rejected him. And here we have Eliab. And he says to his little brother David, I know you, and I know the evil in your heart. And yet we know about Eliab's heart. The Bible tells us about Eliab's heart, that God looked on his heart and thought he wasn't ready. In fact, Eliab says, I know what you've come to do. You've come to look at the battle. Well, Eliab, what have you been doing for the last little while? Now, this is a real lesson for us, because I wonder in leadership whether you ever feel that there are sort of younger people who are doing better than you and maybe getting more recognition and people shooting past you and so on. You're thinking, well, I've done more. And you know, you look at that person who's getting all the recognition and you think, I know what's going on in their heart. Do you know what's really going on? That's just reflecting what's in your heart. You're judging them. And a key thing is we need to be prepared to let people go past us in leadership. The person anointed and chosen by God. Well, David turns around and gets a third opinion on the reality of the prize. Now, of course, having asked so many people about the reward, Saul gets to hear about this, and David is summoned before Saul. Normally, when you meet a king, you let them speak first, but David speaks first. And he says, no one should be afraid. Let no one's heart be afraid because of this Philistine. Now, often we think that when you're afraid of something, let's say you're afraid of spiders. Anyone afraid of spiders? I don't know. What you need to do is get rid of the spider, and then you stop being afraid. But David doesn't say, get rid of the Philistine, then we can stop being afraid. He says, right now, when the fear is there, don't be afraid. No one should be afraid because we have God. And it's so important for us not to fear, and not to fear even when the source of fear is there. Saul says to David, you're not able to fight him. He's a military man. David explains his experience with lions and bears, and this is really remarkable. David was shepherding the flock. Along came a lion, along came a bear, and they would take, not a sheep, they would take a lamb. They take the little ones, that's what they do. And you know what he'd do? Something you won't read about in history or fiction, not even on Tarzan films. He chased after the lion. Chased after a lion. And he would grab it, and he would hit it. Now, what does lion do at this point? At this point, lion, which has lammy in its mouth, drops lammy. That means that mouth is very, very available for other purposes. And he would get it by its mane and strike it and kill it. Remarkable stupidity. I mean, surely the strategic shepherd should think about this. Lambing season is coming round again next year. There will be plenty more lambs. Sheep are having, kids all the time. No, goats have kids. It's okay. Lambs are dispensable. My job is to make a big noise when the animal comes. I can use my sling and slingshot it, but chasing after it, isn't that stupid? Being prepared to lay down your life for a lamb? Crazy. Jesus told this story about that crazy shepherd, but he put it like this: what shepherd, when they have 100 sheep and one goes astray, doesn't leave the 99? And I'm thinking, Jesus, what shepherd does? But, it's in a whole passage where, people do weird things. And the thought that the focus on that one lamb, that he would do it. Surely the strategic shepherd needs to look after the shepherd, because if there's no shepherd, who's going to look after the rest of the flock? And it's such a striking thing that God has given us this image of the shepherd. David is a good shepherd prepared to lay down his life. Of course, our Lord Jesus is the good shepherd who did lay down his life. And in all of this, David doesn't say that his victory over the lion or the bear came from his skill. He says, it was the Lord that delivered me from the paw of the lion, the paw of the bear, and will deliver me from the paw of the Philistine. Yes, it's the same word all the way. Then we have the incident where he tries on Saul's armor. We can picture this as Saul's armor being too big, but that's not what it says. It says he doesn't use it because he hadn't tested it. When you go into battle for the Lord, go with what you've tested. I'm sure there were many, many bored hours while he was a shepherd when he could test out his sling. So he goes ready to fight the Philistine. But what I find interesting is that the fact that he tries on Saul's armor means he hadn't settled in his mind how he was going to defeat the Philistine. In fact, the fact that he takes a stick and 5 stones shows he didn't know the first one was going to work. And he didn't know he wasn't going to have to use a stick. So he goes off to fight the Philistine, who is still protected by his shield bearer. The Philistine sees him. Am I a dog that you come against me with sticks? Goliath, it's not the stick you need to worry about. Goliath curses David by his gods. He says, I'm going to feed you. You're going to make a nice meal for the birds and the beasts. David says, you'll make a nicer meal. And in fact, all of your army will make a very nice meal for the birds and the beasts. But on all of this, David doesn't say he's coming in his strength. He's coming with one amazing weapon, not his sling, the name of the Lord of hosts that you have defied. David quickly moves into the area of danger. He draws out that stone, he slings it, and it goes to the one vital place, the one place which is not protected, his forehead, and Goliath falls forward just as Dagon, the Philistine god, fell forward in chapter 5. Whether he's killed them, we don't know, but he's certainly dead by the time his head has been chopped off. And then the chapter ends showing us how Saul, whose mental capacities we're going to see have been rather stretched, has been forgetting the name of the father he corresponded with just recently for getting his son's employment. Often leaders don't take a lot of care about the people under them, but he does want to know who his father's name is now, because that's the house that's going to be free from taxes in Israel. So there we have the story. What are we to make of it? What's it there for? Well, there are many purposes, but I want to draw 3 particular lessons from this for us. And the first theme is the theme of the concern for God's glory. We know that it is God's will that his name should be glorified. We know that it is God's desire that his name should be glorified, and that we are taught to pray in the Lord's Prayer, let your name be held to be holy. Hallowed be your name. Let your name be held to be special and apart. We know God wants the glory of his name. And we know, therefore, that it is right for us to take steps for the glory of his name. That's what we should be seeking to do. And we know that wherever we see God's name not being glorified, there's work to do. Now, of course, that work needs to start with us internally. Other things in our hearts which are not glorifying God. But there's so much for us to do, and we know that God will be with us when we're seeking to do his will to bring glory to his name. We know this is something God always wants. It's a guaranteed recipe for doing the right thing, to seek God's glory. And here we see the weak up against the strong, and God comes in and says, I want my name to be glorified. Now, we can easily think of this as some sort of tactical thing on the behalf of David, that, he uses the sling, and that's what it's really about. It's saying that the clever, sneaky person who uses tactics wins over the slow, lumbering, big person who doesn't. But the lesson we're supposed to take from this is not David's particular method of doing this. He might have had to get close. He had to get close with the lion and the bear. The lesson we're supposed to take is his concern for God's glory and the fact that he is prepared to go and fight for that. So we need to ask, what steps are there that we need to take for God's glory? But also, he's not doing this on a whim or a feeling about a particular thing he should do. So the second lesson we learn is that he trusts God's revelation. You say, where's that in the passage? Quite simply this: how did he know he could defeat the Philistine? He knew he could defeat the Philistine because he had been anointed by God. He had therefore been commissioned and knew that it was his job to step up to leadership when there was a leadership vacuum. He also knew, by the way, that he had been anointed and told by God, you are going to be king. Therefore he knows that until he is king, because he's not yet king, he is indestructible. He knows, therefore, that what he's doing is based on God's revelation, not just on a feeling. So when we think about what we're called to do, we need to think about what has God revealed to us that we should do. We know God wants his name to be glorified, and we know that his word is completely true, and we need to trust his revelation. But there's a third point I want to major on from this passage. So the first point, that we're concerned for God's glory. Secondly, that we trust God's revelation. But thirdly, that we see with God's eyes. I told you the cheese was important, and I really think it is. A lot of people, I think all of us naturally, look with human eyes, and we see relative importance of people. People looked at Goliath and they thought, there's a great person. He's incredibly scary. Saul saw him. The Israelites saw him. The Philistines saw him. They thought, he's amazing. He's unbeatable. David looked with God's eyes and thought, he's an uncircumcised Philistine who's dared to defy God. He saw God for how big he is, and therefore Goliath for how small he was. People looked at David. Saul looked at David. You can't fight Goliath. Eliab looked at David. You're my little brother. Goliath looked at David and just disdained him. And yet he was the man anointed by God. But also, we see Jesse showing that favoritism to the man in charge of the 1,000 and not to the brothers. And then we see David. He looks at Goliath and he just sees an uncircumcised Philistine. But also David looks at the lamb. And he looks at that little lamb and he thinks that is worth risking my life for. There's a real danger in leadership and in the church generally that we get impressed by VIPs, very important persons. And we look round and we rank people. Maybe we even do it here. And we look round and we think, no, that person in the forum is really significant. And that person in the forum is a little bit less significant. And we look in the church and we see people being more significant and less significant. We're looking with human eyes, and God is concerned about one little lamb. Isn't it interesting that there are different words used for leadership in the Bible? You have the word elder used, referring to someone's age and experience. You have the word overseer used because they look over people and survey them. But you have this word shepherd, which is not a literal word. It's the only major metaphor used for leadership, which occurs again and again in the Bible. Why would God choose that image for leaders? A really important thing, if we're going to see the right sort of growth in the church in Europe, is we need leaders who are shepherds, who think like shepherds and think like the good shepherds. Not the strategic shepherd who says, well, I don't mind about that lamb just going off. They think it is my duty, my bound duty to care for the little lamb. And it's so important that we learn that lesson about the importance of people. That we don't look round rooms and think, well, that person's important, that person's less important. In fact, we learn that God is concerned about the little people. And the measure of our leadership is how concerned we are about the little people, the so-called little people. Now, of course, I realize there's a tension here. Some of you will have responsibility for very large numbers of people in churches and so on. And you will also have some risk of burning out because there's a sense in which you try and take on the responsibility for every single person and it simply overwhelms you. I'm not talking in a way to try and encourage you to feel guilty about what God's not called us to do, which is to be superhuman. We need to recognize the limits of what we can do, and that's fine, and to draw boundaries, but we have to look at the heart. Is our heart such that we would give up everything, that we would risk everything for the sake of that lamb? Or have we thought that as leadership grows and we get more and more responsibilities, somehow those little sheep don't seem to matter anymore? So let's not look around and think in terms of people being super important. There are people who are in high up leadership and they're not corrupted to think that the little sheep don't matter. There are people like Joseph and Daniel who are very faithful in that. Many of the finest moments, of course, of leaders in the Bible are early on, and that's certainly the case with David. We also remember this fight with Goliath is not at the beginning of his career. God's entrusted him the victory because he's already been faithful fighting the lion and the bear. You know, it would have been lovely to have those scenes on YouTube, wouldn't it? Just imagine going back to your brothers and saying about the fight that you had. Yeah, right. But I want us just finally to ask a question we're going to ask every day, and that's, what's this passage teach us about Christ? Well, here we see how Christ David is a picture of Christ, and that we don't overcome through strength, we overcome through weakness. Our Lord Jesus Christ conquered in weakness, and he actually gave his life for the sheep. He loved every single one of us so much, little lambs, wandering sheep that have gone astray, that he gave himself for us at great cost. And isn't that an amazing thing? David's a good shepherd, but Christ is an even better one. Praise be to his name.